Picture this mirrored May 1857, late afternoon. The air is thick with tension, and all of a sudden sepoys erupt in mutiny.
Oh, yeah.
This isn't just some random local incident, though. It's like a wildfire ripping through the city and soon reaching Delhi. We're talking about a huge turning point in history, the start of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the biggest challenge the British East India Company had ever faced.
It's incredible how one tiny thing can set off something so massive.
Right, like that whole thing with the Enfield rifle cartridges?
Yeah, exactly. The rumor that those cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat. You might think so what? But put yourself in the sepoys' shoes. These were soldiers whose whole lives revolved around religious and caste purity. To bite into those cartridges, I mean, that would be a huge violation.
Yeah, a direct attack on their core beliefs makes sense why it caused such outrage.
And that fear was already simmering, fueled by all sorts of rumors going around, like the one about bone dust and flour. It all points to a growing distrust of the British and what they were really up to in India.
Like, the British were constantly poking a hornet's nest, totally oblivious to the resentment they were stirring up.
They definitely underestimated the impact of their social reforms and annexations. These weren't just policy changes. They were seen as attacks on Indian customs and sovereignty. Take Lord Dalhousie's annexation of Awadh in 1856, for instance. It wasn't just about land, it was about upending an entire way of life, disrespecting their ruler Nawab Wajid Ali Shah by kicking him out. Imagine the collective heartbreak and fury in Lucknow when he had to leave people singing songs of lament as he departed.
It's like ripping the heart out of a community. No wonder people were ready to rebel.
And when those sepoys from Meerut got to Delhi, they didn't just come with complaints, they had a plan. They asked Bahadur Shah, the Mughal emperor, to lead them.
They wanted the weight of the Mughal dynasty behind them, right, to give their struggle legitimacy.
Exactly. But Bahadur Shah's position was complicated. He was an aging figurehead, not exactly a powerful ruler. His hesitation speaks volumes.
He must have known the risks, the potential fallout of siding with the rebels.
Oh, absolutely. But surrounded by all those passionate armed sepoys, he eventually gave in. And can you imagine what it was like in those days leading up to the rebellion?
Oh, I bet it was intense. Like, was that whole chapati distribution happening around then? The one where people passed unleavened bread from village to village?
Yes, and to this day we still don't know what it meant. Was it some coded message, a warning signal, an ancient ritual? Who knows? But the fact that it spread so fast across regions and communities says a lot about the mood at the time.
It's like the whole country was holding its breath, waiting for something huge to happen. And it wasn't just the sepoys who I set up, right? All kinds of people joined the rebellion.
Right. Calling it just a sepoy mutiny is misleading. This was a much bigger uprising, a whole mix of rebels with one goal to get rid of British rule. You had peasants, landholders called Tilakdars, religious leaders, even everyday folks, all rising up.
So it was more like a people's rebellion. Give us some examples of these diverse figures.
Okay, well, there's Shah Mal, this charismatic leader who rallied villagers in Uttar Pradesh against those exploitative British revenue policies. Then there's Gonu, a tribal cultivator who got the Kol tribals to fight to protect their land and way of life. And the rebellion wasn't always about grand strategies and big armies. Take the story of Francois Sustaine, a Christian police inspector who got mistaken for a rebel sympathizer just because he talked to a rebel leader.
Wow, it's crazy how one conversation can change your life.
Yeah, it really shows how powerful informal networks and rumors were in spreading the message of rebellion and how fast things could get out of control in such a charged atmosphere.
These stories are so fascinating. They really make history come alive and help us understand what was at stake for people back then.
Totally. And to really get the complexity of the rebellion, we need to look at the specific grievances of different groups. Awadh, the legion we talked about earlier, is a perfect example.
Perfect timing, because I was just going to ask about Awadh. We know the British took it over and exiled the Nawab, but what happened to everyday people? How did British policies affect their lives?
Well, the British saw Awadh as ripe for what they called reform, which basically meant imposing their systems and getting more revenue. The problem was they completely ignored the existing power structures and social fabric of Awadh. They saw the Talukdars, those local landholding elites, as getting in the way of their revenue plans. So they disarmed them, destroyed their forts, stripped them of their authority.
Man, that's asking for trouble. Those Talukdars must have been furious.
You bet they were. They lost land prestige, the ability to protect their interests, and the peasants, who were often tied to them through all these complex social and economic relationships, they found themselves directly under the British revenue system, which was super harsh and inflexible.
So the British basically broke the traditional bonds between the Talukdars and the peasants, leaving both groups feeling exploited and vulnerable.
Exactly. And it gets worse. The British overassessed revenue in some areas, increasing the demand by like 70%. Imagine the impact on people who were already struggling.
That's brutal. It's like they were intentionally trying to squeeze every last rupee out of them. No wonder people were ready to revolt.
And it wasn't just economics. The British treated the peasants with such disrespect, fueling the resentment. They dismissed their customs, ignored their struggles, and enforced their rules with an iron fist. The safety net that the Talipdars had provided, even if it wasn't perfect, was gone.
So the peasants were left with nothing, no one to turn to but each other. And then there were the sepoys. Many of them were from Awad, right?
Yes, and they were deeply connected to their villages, their families. They knew what was happening back home. The stories of suffering, the anger toward the British, it all made its way into the sepoy ranks, adding fuel to the fire.
It's incredible how it's all connected like threads, weaving together to create this tapestry of rebellion. You've got the Talukdars stripped of their power, the peasants burdened by taxes and mistreatment, and the sepoys caught between loyalty to their communities and their duty to the army.
And we haven't even talked about the growing tension between the sepoys and their British officers. Over time, that camaraderie they once shared faded away.
It's like the more powerful the British got, the less they saw the sepoys as equals.
Exactly. There was this growing sense of racial superiority among the British, and they started treating the sepoys with open disdain and disrespect. The abuses piled up, chipping away at the trust that had once bound them together.
So you have this powder keg of resentment, religious anxieties, social upheaval, economic hardship, and military discontent all building up. Then the cartridge controversy comes along.
And boom, that was the stuck.
So we've got this powder keg ready to blow, this huge rebellion breaking out. But what were they actually fighting for? What did the rebels want for India if they actually managed to get rid of the British?
Yeah, it's a question that often gets missed, doesn't it? We tend to get caught up in the events, the battles, the big names. But what about the hopes and dreams that drove this whole thing? What kind of future did they have in mind?
It's almost like we assume they were just reacting against something, not actually fighting for something.
And that's where things get really interesting. The British, since they won, got to write most of the history. They painted the rebels as these ungrateful savages, a danger to the order and progress they brought to India. But if we look a little closer at the stuff they left behind, we start to see a different picture.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. What kind of stuff are we talking about? Where can we find clues about what the rebels wanted?
Think about things like proclamations, official announcements, letters from rebel leaders, even first-hand accounts from people who were there. It's like putting a puzzle together, and some pieces are missing for sure, but the image that comes out is fascinating.
All right, let's get into it. What do these sources tell us?
One of the most striking things is how much they talk about unity. Many proclamations, even the ones from Muslim leaders, went out of their way to speak to both Hindus and Muslims, calling for them to unite against the British.
So they were trying to overcome those religious divisions that the British often used to stay in control.
Exactly. Like, look at the Assamgarh Proclamation. It clearly says that both Hindus and Muslims were suffering under British rule. It calls for lower taxes, bringing back traditional industries, and respect for both religions. It's a powerful statement about shared grievances and a common hope for a better future.
It's pretty inspiring, actually, people coming together despite their differences to fight for a shared cause. It wasn't just talk, right? Were there times when Hindus and Muslims actually fought side by side?
Oh, absolutely. There are stories of the British trying to stir up religious trouble in places like Bareilly, even spending tons of money to do it. But it didn't work. The rebellion at its heart was about taking back India for Indians no matter their religion.
Yeah, it reminds you that unity can be a really strong force for change. So what about this idea of going back to a pre-colonial world? Was that a common thing among the rebels?
You see that a lot in what they said. There's a clear longing for the time before the British, a time when traditional ways and customs were respected. Some proclamations even praised the Mughal Empire, talking about how different communities lived together peacefully under their rule.
It kind of sounds like they were looking back with rose-colored glasses, maybe even idealizing the past a little.
There's definitely some of that, but it wasn't just about romanticizing the good old days. They also wanted to deal with the real injustices of the time. The rebels weren't just fighting against British rule, they were fighting for something better.
So what were they fighting for? What kind of changes did they hope to see?
Well, their actions tell us a lot. They went after symbols of British oppression. We have stories about them burning account books, the records of debts and taxes the British forced on them. They also attacked moneylenders' houses, who were often seen as working with the British.
So they were trying to overthrow not just the British power structure, but also the local elites who helped them exploit the people.
Exactly. You can see a vision for a more just and equal society, a desire to break free from both colonial rule and oppressive local hierarchies. And in some cities they took over, like Delhi and Lucknow. They even tried to set up their own governments, even though they didn't last long. These attempts, even if they were brief, show us how much they wanted to go back to pre-colonial ways of ruling.
It's wild to think what might have happened if they had pulled it off. What if they'd kept control of those cities and actually created an independent Indian government?
Yeah, it's one of those what-if moments in history. But even though they were eventually crushed by the British, the things they wanted their vision for, a free and just India, it had a lasting impact. It inspired generations of nationalists who kept fighting.
So even though they lost, the rebels kind of won in a way?
For sure, their sacrifices, it inspired people for years to come. The 1857 rebellion proved that British power wasn't unbeatable, that you could stand up to it, that resistance was possible. It became a symbol of defiance, a rallying cry for people who dreamed of a free India.
Like it provided a plan for resistance, a shared story of struggle that people from different backgrounds and places could connect with. And that's probably its most important legacy.
Definitely. The rebellion became a crucial moment for the Indian independence movement. It showed that a united front across religions and regions could seriously threaten British rule. It inspired leaders, writers, and activists to imagine a different future for India, one where they were in control.
Okay, so now let's switch gears. We've talked about what motivated the rebels and what they wanted. Now let's look at how the British reacted to this unprecedented challenge.
Well, the British response was fast and brutal. They weren't playing around. They imposed martial law, which basically meant they threw out the normal legal processes and gave military officers a ton of power to punish anyone they even suspected of being a rebel. Forget about due process.
So it was basically anything goes, a total crackdown.
Yeah, they knew how important Delhi was, so they focused all their military power on taking it back. The fighting was intense, with lots of casualties on both sides. It took months of bloody battles before they finally got control again.
And it wasn't just about brute force, right? Didn't they use some clever strategies to divide the rebels and weaken them?
Oh yeah, they were masters of playing the game in Awadh, where the resistance was really strong. They offered to give back land to the Talukdars, who stayed loyal. It was a brilliant move to split the rebels, make them fight each other.
So they used both military power and smart political moves. They met violence with violence, but they also knew how to take advantage of existing tensions and rivalries.
Exactly. It reminds you that power is often about using force and manipulation. But to really get the impact of the rebellion, we need to go beyond the battlefield. We need to look at how it was portrayed, how people saw it, both back then and in the years that followed. And that's where images come in.
Oh, this is my favorite part. We're talking about paintings, cartoons, photographs, all those visual stories that capture the emotions and ideas of a specific time. So where do we start?
Let's start with the British side. What's interesting is how they used images to send a bunch of different messages. Some were about celebrating British heroism, making people feel sympathy for their suffering and losses during the rebellion. A great example is Relief of Lucknow by Thomas Jones Barker. It shows that dramatic scene when British forces break through the siege and rescue the people trapped inside.
Yeah, it's that classic image of bravery and toughness, perfect for making people back in Britain feel patriotic. But weren't there some images that took a more, shall we say, inflammatory approach?
Definitely, there was a deliberate effort to make the rebels look bad, to paint them as savage and uncivilized, especially in how they supposedly treated women and children. This was part of that whole honor of British women story, a powerful tool to rile up the public back in Britain and justify being really harsh with the rebels.
Ah, yes, that classic trope. The helpless, innocent Englishwoman threatened by the uncivilized native man. It's a sad, recurring theme in colonial history. What kind of images did they use to push that narrative?
One that comes to mind is In Memoriam by Joseph Noel Paton. It shows a bunch of scared English women and children huddled together like they're about to be attacked by the rebels.
It's powerful stuff designed to make people angry and want revenge, but it's also super manipulative, playing on deep-seated fears and prejudices.
And it wasn't just about showing English women as victims. There were also images of them as heroic defenders fighting back against the rebels, sometimes taking down multiple attackers all by themselves.
It's kind of contradictory, isn't it? This helpless damsel in distress who's also a fierce warrior. It's like they wanted to have it both ways, reinforcing this idea that the British were in a righteous battle, protecting their civilization from savagery.
Exactly. It's a clever way to justify violence and aggression while still appealing to those Victorian ideas about femininity. And this desire for revenge, this need for payback, it was all over the visual representations from the British side.
Any other examples you can think of?
Well, there's that Punch cartoon with the allegorical figure of justice. She's like this powerful warrior queen stomping on sepoys with protecting English women and children. It's a very clear message. The British are the good guys, the bringers of justice, and the rebels deserve to be totally defeated and punished.
And the British definitely weren't shy about showing off their punishments, were they?
Nope. Images of executions, especially the horrible practice of blowing rebels from cannons, they were everywhere. These weren't just gruesome spectacles, they were meant to send a message.
A message of terror and total power, like, this is what happens when you defy us.
Exactly, and even when some people within the British establishment started speaking up for a less extreme approach, they were often made fun of and ignored. Remember that famous Punch cartoon mocking Lord Canning, the Governor General, for suggesting they be more lenient? It shows how much people wanted revenge.
So it was a time for vengeance, not mercy. The British were determined to crush the rebellion and show everyone who was boss, and they used images to justify their actions and strengthen their grip on power. But what about the Indian side? Did they create their own images of the rebellion?
They did, but those images came much later in the 20th century as part of the growing nationalist movement. The rebellion was reframed as the First War of Independence, this heroic struggle against colonial oppression.
So a deliberate shift in the story from a failed mutiny to a key moment in India's fight for freedom.
Exactly. And this new interpretation was reflected in how they portrayed the rebel leaders. Figures like Rani Lakshmibai, the Queen of Jhansi, became icons of resistance.
Ah, yes, the legendary Rani Lakshmibai. I can totally picture her charging into battle sword in hand. It's an image that's become synonymous with courage and defiance, inspiring generations of Indians.
And that's the power of images, isn't it? They can change how we understand history, turn villains into heroes, and even rewrite the story to fit what's happening in the present.
It reminds you that history isn't just a bunch of facts and dates. It's a living, breathing story that keeps getting told and retold, often through the powerful language of images. Okay, so we've talked about all the anxieties and frustrations, the utter desperation that sparked this rebellion. We've seen how the British fought back with a mix of brute force and, some pretty clever maneuvering. We even dug into how images can really shape our understanding of this whole event. But here's the big question. What lasting impact did the 1857 rebellion have? Did it actually change anything?
Oh, it was a turning point for sure. It forced the British to face a reality they'd been trying to ignore. Their control over India wasn't absolute, and their policies, and, they had serious consequences.
They couldn't just pretend it didn't happen and go back to business as usual.
Right. The most immediate and symbolic change was the end of the East India Company's rule. In 1858, Queen Victoria stepped in, taking direct control over India, and that's when the British Raj really began.
So it was a shift in power, but India was still a colony. Did anything really change for the people living under British rule?
Well, the British did introduce some reforms after the rebellion. They tried to appease the Indian princes by promising to respect their lands and rights, hoping to avoid more uprisings. They reorganized the army, making sure that British officers held all the important positions. And they even gave the sepoys some concessions, better paying conditions to some extent.
Sounds like a mix of trying to keep people happy and tightening their grip. But did any of these reforms actually address the root causes of colonialism? The exploitation, the inequality?
Yeah, that's the big question. The British might have dealt with some of the immediate triggers of the rebellion, but they didn't really change the power dynamics. India was still a colony, its resources, and people were still under British control.
So in a way, you could say the rebellion failed. They didn't get independence, and the British kept ruling for almost another century.
From a purely political standpoint, yeah, the rebellion didn't achieve its immediate goals. But to say it was a total failure would be wrong. The impact of the 1857 rebellion went way beyond the fighting. It planted the seeds for something much bigger, something that would grow over the next few decades: Indian nationalism.
So even in defeat, the rebels kind of won.
Absolutely. Their struggles, their sacrifice, it inspired future generations. The 1857 rebellion showed that the British could be challenged, that resistance was possible. It became the symbol of defiance, a rallying cry for those who dreamed of a free India.
It's like it provided a blueprint for resistance, a shared story of struggle that resonated with people from all walks of life. And you could say that's its most enduring legacy.
Exactly. The rebellion became a touchstone for the Indian independence movement. It showed that a united front across religions and regions could really threaten British rule. It inspired leaders, writers, and activists to imagine a different future for India, one where they were in control.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the 1857 rebellion, remember, it wasn't just about battles and sieges. It was about ideas, aspirations, a vision for a future where India was free to decide its own fate. And those ideas, those aspirations, they didn't disappear when the rebellion was crushed. They were passed down through generations, fueling the long and ultimately successful fight for independence.
Yeah, it's a story of courage, resilience, and the power of hope. It reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can endure, and that the dream of freedom can never truly be extinguished.
It's a powerful reminder that history is made not just by the victors, but by those who dared to resist, who fought for a better world, even when the odds were stacked against them.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration of history. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the spirit of curiosity alive.